If you'd like to learn whether the Rock Retirement Club could be an important piece of your retirement puzzle, come hang out with me on Thursday, July 15th at 7 p.m., and I'll share a little bit about the club, answer your questions, and we can just talk about rock and retirement. Learn more at livewithroger.com. Do you want to have the confidence to truly rock retirement? Well, I'm going to show you how on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Hey there, welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. It's good to be back in Texas. I got back last week from Colorado, a 5-week, I don't know if you call it a vacation, sabbatical, because I did some work. I did a lot of contemplation, have some insights or perspective that I'll share at a future date, but we have way too much to do today to get into that. So our theme for July is going to be choosing your withdrawal strategy. Oh, this is a big topic. I really should have chosen a 5-week month. I'll have to remember that when I think about these topics, but we're going to get it done in 4 weeks. And we're going to talk about how do you figure out which retirement withdrawal strategy you use, because there are probably more than you realize. So that's what we're going to get in today. We're going to talk a little bit about the 4% rule today, and then build on different strategies, ending in the last episode. And hopefully, if we're successful, helping you have a framework for figuring out yours, because one size doesn't fit all here when we talk about withdrawal strategies. So we're going to get into that today. Just FYI, next month on the show, August, can't believe I'm already talking about August, our theme is going to be women in retirement. So we're going to spend an entire month talking from the perspective of a female and what might be some things that a female needs to consider that might not apply to us gents. And we're going to have Tanya Nichols on for the whole month to help us on that subject. And then one last thing before we get into our main segment, and I don't do this really on the show very often, but the way that people find this show is through primarily either a word from a friend, hey, check this out, or searching for retirement podcasts in iTunes or Stitcher or whatever service you use. So if you're enjoying the show and you want to help build the community of people that can share their wisdom, it'd be awesome if you could leave an honest review on whatever service you use. That would help others discover the show. With that, let's get on to talking about withdrawal strategies. There are 3 big rocks in retirement planning, and it is very easy to forget these 3 big rocks. Honestly, in almost every conversation I have to bring people back to one of these 3 rocks because it's easy to put things out of order, and these have to go in a certain order. And I think what happens is when you're engaged in thinking about retirement or retirement planning, you get bombarded with all different types of strategies, tactics, etc. And so it's easy to mix this stuff up, which can cause you to focus on potentially the wrong thing. So what are these 3 big rocks? The big rock number 1, the first rock, is feasibility. What is possible given the resources that we have and the priorities we have for our life? Can we buy that lake house? Can I retire 2 years earlier than I was planning? Can I take no investment risk and still be okay? Can we give money to our children? These are all questions that come down to figuring out what is feasible. And we've done a lot of series on these of what do you want out of life? Dreaming big about your retirement. The first thing you need to do, the first big rock is how much life can we squeeze out of the assets that we have that is sustainable over our 30, 40 years potentially in retirement? What is feasible? That's one rock. That's the first rock. You want to start there because the whole point of all these assets is for you to create the life that you want. Rock number 1. Rock number 2, once we have a feasible roadmap, is you want to make sure it's resilient. resilient so you don't get thrown off course by bad markets, by high inflation, by you changing your mind or some life shock financially or otherwise. You want to make it resilient, right? If you're going to head on a course to a destination or a journey that you really want, you can chart your course, but then you have to figure out, how do I do that so I don't get thrown off course easily? That is what choosing your withdrawal strategy is about. It fits within the resiliency rock. The last rock, which does not apply here, is the tactical optionality, the options that you have to enhance the journey. That could be tax planning, that could be withdrawal categories that you pull money out of, that could be asset allocation, etc. That's in the last one. That's the enhancement of the overall plan. But if you don't have a feasible plan that you have made resilient, all the tactical stuff isn't going to matter. And I think of Roth conversions as an example. Sure, it can have a big impact on a plan, but it's in the last rock. It's an enhancement to the important stuff. Having something that's feasible that you care about and having it resilient so you don't get thrown off course easy. In many cases, all of the tactical stuff that we think about, even if we screw all those up, if we get the first two rocks right, we're doing pretty good. Maybe we spent too much money on taxes and so forth, but it won't derail our life. So we're going to talk about resiliency when we talk about choosing your withdrawal strategy. Because what retirement planning is about is not so much optimization of the numbers, but securing outcomes. And those outcomes are the life that you're going to live and having it be sustainable. So what I want to do is start with a conversation with a good friend of mine, JAMIE Hopkins. He is a managing partner of Wealth Solutions and the director of retirement research at Carson Wealth Management, an author of a number of retirement books, including Rewirement, Rewiring the Way You Think About Retirement. He just updated with a new edition of that book. And he is at heart an academic who has studied retirement planning for a number of years. And JAMIE and I are going to talk about just withdrawal strategies in general and all the psychological part of this equation. So let's have a chat with JAMIE, and then we're going to get into the main topic of talking about one withdrawal strategy, which is the 4% rule. So JAMIE, I'm excited that I got to chat with you before you went back to your pre-COVID haircut.
Yeah, I've got about 9.5 inches on my head right now, and it's coming off soon, but I'm actually going to be donating it too. So I know a lot of people ask me about that, what I'm doing, but my sister actually went through chemo when she was 8. And I remember her kind of picking a wig. She didn't wear it much, but kind of halfway through COVID, I decided, you know what, I think I can just stretch this out till I get it long enough and donate it. And I'll donate some money then too. So that's kind of my goal here.
Yeah. And for those of you that are just listening, he and I were talking and he's been letting his hair grow out and he has an amazing head of hair. So they can't see you, but I'll definitely share the picture. Maybe I'll take a screenshot of you just moving it all around. Anyway, the reason I wanted to have you on the show, JAMIE, is this whole month on the show is about selecting your withdrawal strategy. Once you go from sowing and accumulating assets to decumulation. And what I have found, and I'm thinking you found in your research, is this is a harder transition mentally than people give it credit for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big mental change. And I spent 7 years at a college where all I did was teach and build programs about retirement income, so the distribution side. And we did a lot of research back then, and we look at Americans, and we found out is, actually Americans, by the time they get close to retirement, they're actually fairly financially literate. You hear a lot about people aren't literate, but you actually develop that over your life and you become decently literate. You learn how to save, you learn how to put money around, you've learned how to budget, you've survived to your 60s. Like you figured a lot of that stuff out. But what I always tell people is you learn how to save, not spend really your assets, right? And because all you've been told is put money in the 401k, put money in the IRA, invest it, let it grow, let it grow, let it grow. Then all of a sudden you get to this time period where you got to take it out, you got to spend it. And it's actually harder because the rules of thumb on saving and investing are fairly clear, right? Save 10% of your paycheck, invest it, low cost, index funds.
Embrace risk, don't look at it ever, that type of thing.
Yeah. When you get to income planning, there's not as many kind of uniform agreed upon principles, right? So for people, it's harder to kind of figure out what you want to do there anyways.
And usually it's the people that have saved the most, that have been really good at the accumulation and denying themselves, that they have the hardest time of actually reaping what they've sowed. Do you think there's a point where you can get to a uniform way of doing it, given that in retirement, people are spending in all different sorts of ways?
I don't at all. Like literally, there was a doctor that was texting me this week, and he's a good guy, and he's on Twitter, Dr. David Roney, and he's actually a surgeon in the Navy. And he said, well, explain it to me like I'm 5. And I'm like, retirement income planning might be harder in some senses than surgery because the rules are so dependent on the individual, their goals and their outcomes, right? I mean, reality is a distribution strategy for somebody who's maybe not real healthy and is only going to live 7 years in retirement versus somebody like my grandfather who is, 98 and he's still playing tennis 3-4 times a week. Entirely different distribution approaches there, right? And that's the thing that's just, it's hard to then come up with the best practice because if I have a 7-year time horizon and a 40-year time horizon, they're just not going to be the same. They're never going to be the same, right? Like even the baseline principles, one, I'm dealing with longevity risk, and the other one, I'm probably just dealing with higher tax risk because I'm distributing across shorter periods of time and legacy is going to be more important. So to me, there are some fundamentals and risks that we have to deal with, but mostly when I talk to individuals, you have to start with their goals. What are you trying to accomplish? And then you have to work back from there. I mean, there's no other good way to do it. I'd say most advisors and financial people are moving towards goal-based investing and planning in general, but with income planning, I really find it hard to do anything that doesn't start with a person's, what do you want to accomplish to some degree.
Which ends up being, what is your current iteration of what you want to accomplish? We don't talk about it as much, how often people change their mind about what they want their life to be.
Yep. It's a great point, right? I had some discussion, or I was watching one recently that talked about that too. I mean, even goals, right? Like setting your goals for retirement. I mean, that's got to be not written in ink by any means either, right? Like what you want to do in 30 years, if you probably asked yourself, are you doing what you thought you'd be doing 30 years ago? The answer is probably no, right? I don't think you and I would have answered, hey, we're going to be on this podcast in different states on Zoom.
Exactly.
Right? Like, yeah, we weren't picking that out. So I kind of use an analogy with that is I always say it's retirement income planning distributions like trying to hit a moving target in the wind, right? The target's your goals, but honestly, it's moving all over the place, right? We don't know exactly where it's going to be. It's moving up, it's moving back. And right, there's wind because things are going to change along the way. We can't go in a straight line. We'll never hit the target, right? So it's kind of like flying to the moon also, where I think they're only on track something like 0.2% of the time, but they typically get to their destination within a couple seconds of what they prepared for, which is a pretty amazing thing because they actually prepare to be off course most of the time.
Yeah. And I think that's one reason why through my journey, I went outside the industry to agile methodology and really started to adopt a lot of that is because the key is all in the adjustments, right? The iteration. So when you're getting close to retirement, how do you start to change your mental model to start to navigate this?
Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches. The one that I become more and more kind of appealing towards, and it's obviously not doable for everyone, and it feels a little counterintuitive, which maybe is why I like it. But I actually have started this notion of telling people to spend more money while they're still working before they retire. You get a lot of people that they start to enter in retirement, like maybe 5 years before. They sit down, they kind of do a budget, and that's great. We see this projection, and they say, you know what? We got to save every dime we can for the next 5 years. This is very normal. And then what we see is, right, catch-up contributions. They're maxing out everything. They're not going on vacations. They're not spending any money. And they really, really, actually, a lot of them end up retiring slightly earlier than they expected to, because in essence, you kind of burn yourself out. and had this notion that, you know what, that's probably the worst possible thing you can do. Because reality is, let's say you save an extra 50 grand over those 5 years and you don't take any vacations, but you're making 100 grand a year. Well, you know, it would be a lot better working 1 year longer and saving nothing over those 5 years. That'll improve. I mean, really, any portfolio, any amount that you want to draw up, that'll improve your portfolio. It'll improve your retirement. So I actually start telling people, you know, start spending more instead of saving that 10 grand. Actually, if you can work 1 year longer and you take $5,000-$10,000 vacations over that time period, would you work an additional year? If the answer is yes, that's a good way to start learning how to spend money too, and realize like the benefits of having income. It teaches a lot of good lessons. And I think if you buckle down in that mindset that we're going to save everything, you're going to carry that into retirement. There's no way to spend 5 years of saving and penny pinching and not doing anything and then expect the day you retire and now don't have safe income coming in that you're somehow going to change that mentality. Right?
It may get worse because now your income is gone, right?
Yeah. You just trained yourself for 5 years to not do this, right? Yeah. And then you can't change human behavior that fast. And we see that if you look at some macro spending data, you get some people that actually increase spending rate when they get to a retirement, but a lot of people actually decrease spending like right away. And they're kind of self-insuring against all the different risks out there is probably the best way to describe what's actually occurring.
Yeah. And a lot of that comes from the concept of they're worried about the end of life so much that they miss their current life. And even the 4% rule, which we're going to talk about next week, statistically, you'll likely end up with more than enough money. So you overshot because you're worried about the end of life.
Yeah. I mean, I think historically, right, more than half the time you'll actually die with more money than you started with.
I think that's a shame. If you die with more than you wanted to, I think of it as regret minimalization. I think that came from Jeff Bezos or somebody. So let me ask you this on the spending in retirement part of it is, do you think some of that comes from that buckle down, comes from the whole idea of what's my number, which we used to talk about in retirement, and it's never enough just because the math doesn't quite work?
Yeah, I think that magic number idea, that's a framing kind of structure, right? Once you frame your mindset about that, like that's the number you're supposed to have. You're not framed like, well, I need just pick a number, 1 million at 65 and I need 750,000 at 75. Like I've never met anyone that said that, right? Like now, I guess if you did that, you would have a better understanding of, right, a spend down, but there's nobody, literally never seen anything around that. The other one is, I mean, I think of this, I say the spending's not savings, the SNS. When you're working, I mean, everything is geared around putting money into your 401k and just seeing it go up, right? Like that is basically it. And we do know that people, when they use their apps on their phones, I think it was Wells Fargo one time put out, right, that like 90% of app logins, the only thing the person is doing is making sure the money is still there, right? It's the number one use of it is just checking the balance, right? That's why it's number one on every single thing you go to. You want to check the balance? I do want to check the balance. That's what we do. And then we get to retirement and we've just now spent 30 years checking the balance and making sure it went up. So then all of a sudden to go check the balance and make sure it went down is not something we've ever been trained for. And that's what I always go back to. It's not an intelligence thing. It's not anything besides the fact we haven't had experience do it. We haven't been taught it. We haven't been trained to do it. If you have experience doing one thing and get trained to do one thing and do something for 30 years, guess what you're going to do? The thing that you were trained on, had experience and did for 30 years, right? It's very hard to overcome habit. And that's a developed habit and experience issue. I've kind of gotten away from that literacy issue. I don't think that's our biggest thing. Obviously, education remains very important, right? You have to learn about stuff, right? I can't make decisions about things I don't know about, but I don't think that's the biggest thing holding people back.
Yeah. And I think that honestly, if you're near retirement and literacy is the issue, you probably have bigger issues because you didn't do all the right things. And that's a whole separate conversation, right?
Yeah, it really is. And there's some interesting things in the literacy side. You know, Lusardi and Mitchell, who are very well-known academics on that side. And they're much more in the, you know, we have to raise up literacy and that'll fix things. And there is a different camp of people who actually say, you know what, literacy comes when you need it to some degree too. So like if somebody isn't on a path to being, they're not doing the right things in general at an early age to create wealth, they don't believe that there's a wealth future for them, they tend not to learn about it. And there's some good evidence of that. Like when a spouse passes away and you have one spouse that manages all the finances, finances, guess what happens? Like that other spouse actually becomes very literate in finances pretty quickly because they have to, right? Like you're forced to learn about it. And you do see literacy rates like skyrocket about finances a couple years after the one spouse dies. So there is some notion that I guess people in time learning, but obviously the lack of literacy, as you said, can cause us a whole bunch of problems leading up to retirement. And then now we don't.
That's generally not the people that are dealing with the decisions,
accumulation issues.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
So if you're going to spend money earlier than retirement, which I think I get the logic of that. One thing I talk about psychologically with people, if you're going to do that, because in your mind, let's say you're 5 years out from retirement, Jamie, and it's like, I need to get out of this job. I'm working too hard. The pace is too hard. And you're telling me to work another year. I would imagine what needs to be coupled with that is, well, since you know you're only 5 or 6 years out, actually start to build some boundaries and not act like you're trying to build your career anymore. You do your work, you honor your employer, but you don't have to say yes all the time. I'd imagine you have to create those.
Yeah, you absolutely do, right? That's why I bring in what could you do if you had an extra 10 grand to go on vacations each year? Very few Americans use up all their vacation time, right? So you're 62 and all of a sudden you have $10,000 you didn't think you were going to have, and you can go take maybe 3 vacations on that, right? And does that help you stay more balanced in life so you can work another year, right? I think it's harder just to tell people to work another year, right? But you kind of have to change that up a little bit. If you do have the kind of blessing or opportunity to actually work part-time and do a phased retirement, even better, right? Society of
I think that's the
Actuaries
ideal. Yeah, I think that's the ideal.
I mean, Society of Actuaries in the UK also has great data on how healthy that is for people, because one big challenge also with like you work, you have this retirement day and you leave is a lot of people struggle with meaning right after that. And we actually see retirement's an interesting time period because it's actually the happiest people, right? Or married grandparents in retirement, I think are the happiest group in existence. However, we see it on both ends. So actually happiness goes up on average, but you get a larger group of depressed people actually in retirement. So that actually rises also. So you kind of get both ends move up. That lack of meaning is another big thing. So, and you can't always spend your way to meaning, I mean, that's another issue. Your distribution strategy won't always fix that. But there's also the joke, I've never seen an unhappy person on a jet ski. So if you can spend towards your goals, right? You actually can, spending does impact happiness, but there is some diminishing effects of that at some point.
So before we're done here, I want to circle back to something you talked about in that we're programmed as accumulators to look at our accounts, and we have this natural tailwind of the contributions going in. So even if the markets are wonky, usually we're even to a little bit up. And I know it's the beginning of July. I update my net worth statement every quarter. I like doing that. Right? Because I'm saving and markets have been good. So I like to see, because I put them side by side. So in retirement, imagine behaviorally, you lose your income and you're not contributing. And now you're supposed to spend your money and you're seeing your balances potentially go down rather than up. That seems like a toxic cocktail from feeling confident. So are there any things that you can do to mitigate that?
Well, I think it's different for different people, but as you probably already tell for people who are listening, I tend to go back to research with a lot of my stuff. I'm an academic. I've been a professor now for, I think, coming on 10 years. And there's a lot of research about retirement confidence and actually what moves it up. A big one is secure income in retirement. And I use that term, right? I mean, you can get into what does secure mean, but that's Social Security, it's pensions, it's annuities. You can throw things like rental income in there too, even though I am always kind of hedge people there is a little bit of risk there. And this last year, there was a lot of risk in the rental income world, right? A lot of people still aren't paying rent. But you do see people with those kind of steady flows of cash coming in. They are happier and they feel more secure in retirement. Interestingly enough, those people actually live longer. It's not sure that that's the causation, right? But they're correlated. But they do live longer for whatever you want to take that being. They're happier, they live longer. And they spend more money. So when you kind of look at that, right? Because what are you doing? You're kind of, I mentioned this before, you're not self-insuring everything. So a lot of people are just worried about the future, right? Because they don't know how long I'm going to live. I don't know how much money I need. So if I live to 95 and I have all these healthcare expenditures there, I need to save money for that unknown. But as you build in lifetime streams, it does help with that. And as I said, it doesn't have to be any particular product. It's just you have some type of secure income around whatever source that might be.
Yeah. And I can say from my experience walking life with clients, having, we call it social capital, having secure income or that minimum dignity floor, at least for the needs, right? That baseline life, right? It sets you up psychologically. You could even fund it like we build income floors, right? We'll build a 5-year ladder to pre-fund consumption. Even doing that, well, at least you know where you're going to get your money from.
Yeah. And if you start looking at a lot of the distribution strategies, they kind of take to some degree that approach, right? So the one you kind of mentioned, if however you want to draw that one, if you build a flooring strategy, right, and basic needs, that's one of the distribution type strategies is figure out what those basic needs are, floor them, and everything else becomes kind of discretionary spending. And Tom Hegna, who's a friend of mine and people on the show probably maybe have heard him before and the group has heard him, but he always calls it like paychecks and play checks, right? So it's replacing your paycheck and then everything else is the fun stuff. Then bucketing or time segmentation, right? As you said, ladder something for a multiple year time period. And people like that because they look out and say, well, I like knowing that the next 5 years are good. Right. It also behaviorally allows a lot of people to take more risk with their portfolio long term because they feel safer with the short term version. And then even the safe withdrawal rate, even though that was the 4% rule, you said you're going to talk about it next week, but that was not designed to be a retirement income distribution strategy. It's always one of those things like that wasn't Bill Bengen's desire at that point.
Right.
But if you even think about that, the whole notion of that is kind of giving you this framing of what's the minimum amount, right, I could spend without running out of money. So it's kind of all of them have this safety approach to the way you describe those three main strategies.
So would you agree with this statement that the numbers and the efficiency of how you allocate your assets to create your withdrawal strategy is important? But what I hear you say, and this is, I think, mirrors my belief unless I misheard, this is a lot less of a optimization of the numbers and more of an optimization of putting yourself into position for success behaviorally.
Yeah, I would say I'm probably 100%. That was a great restatement of 15 minutes of me talking, right? But I mean, it's why I wrote my book, right? Was literally because I saw all these behavioral challenges. The numbers, right? I mean, the numbers always come out as a math problem and we can solve for that with the best data that we have. The behavioral stuff is not always as clear. It's fuzzier. And I always say, humans are messy. And that's what's also great about us too, is that we are different. And it's the fun part about behavioral finance is actually everyone doesn't react to things the same. Like we talk about things like, oh, people do this in this situation. Well, like it's usually like 56% of people do it in that situation. Right. There's another 40% that do it a completely different way. But we found that that's statistically important. And so we say that's how people react. But yeah, I mean, the more time I've been in this space, the more time I spend with people and sit down with people across the room from them on a couch in a financial planning office. And I've just learned that optimization, most people don't really care about. It's not what's important to them because you can create some really cool optimized tax efficient strategies that people just hate and they're not going to do it. And it's not accomplishing what they want. And that's that's kind of what we're here. So if you look at it as an industry, it's a service industry and the optimization is typically not about serving people.
Right. It may optimize the numbers if you do it, but it definitely doesn't optimize your life in terms of executing it. So I encourage everybody to pick up Rewirement, Rewiring the Way You Think About Retirement, which is Jamie's book, just recently updated. And then you're going to be in the club in a week or so to hang out with Rock Retirement Club members to talk more about these concepts and have a lot of Q&A. So Jamie, I appreciate you. Send me a lock of that hair when you cut some off. Will you? Don't.
I guess you might be able to go in and try to get the wig, but I think I think they go to kids. So I don't
more
think
important
you're
to
have
them.
A chance. Yeah.
All right, buddy. You look great. Thank you for sharing your wisdom.
No, I really appreciate being on. I mean, I think we kind of kept it mellow today, but in pieces in there, you can see I get a little bit excited about this. I try to keep it smooth today, but I love this topic. And, I really appreciate you having me on and everyone. I will be at the Rock Retirement Club in a couple of weeks with you. So it'll be fun too. Appreciate it.
All right, big guy. Thanks. Now, in my conversation with Jamie, I told him that we're going to talk about the 4% rule next week, but actually, we're going to talk about it this week. I changed things up because the way this theme is going to go is we're going to talk about the 4% rule today so you get a general understanding of it. Next week, we're going to talk about another withdrawal strategy called the safety first approach. Then the third week, we're going to talk about a strategy which is a hybrid of matching your assets to your liabilities or your spending. And then in the last week, what I want to do is create this framework so you can figure out which one might be most appropriate for you, because these are definitely not one size fits all. So we're going to talk about that. So today I just want to highlight what we mean by the 4% rule, because this is probably one of the most talked about withdrawal strategies, especially in the finance community. And maybe this is inside baseball, but finance planners talk about this stuff all the time and they get big arguments about it. What the 4% rule is essentially what someone has argued is what's called a safe withdrawal rate, SWR, which is what is the amount that I can pull from my assets safely each year without running out of money, because we don't want to do that. Remember, we got to secure outcomes. Where the 4% number came from was a paper written by a financial planner, William Bengen, back in October of 1994, where he sought to establish or look at what would be a safe withdrawal rate, because there wasn't really a lot of research on what it could be. So what he did was he looked at historical data of the S&P 500 and intermediate bonds, and I think he put together a 50-50 portfolio, but he tested other ones. And he said, what is a safe annual withdrawal rate that I can take from an investment portfolio without running out of money over a typical retirement timeframe? I think it was 33 years that he used. So he looked at all the historical performance data and he ran models to find a percentage withdrawal from, say, $1 million portfolio that would not run out of money over a typical retirement lifetime. And he came out with 4% from financial assets. So if you had $1 million, you could take out 4% of that, which is $40,000. And then within that, he assumed that that 4% amount, that $40,000, would adjust for inflation each year. And the objective here was, what is a steady stream of income that doesn't deplete the assets before someone dies? And he determined from his work that it was roughly 4%. And that paper was a pretty big deal. And it has gained momentum ever since. And it now is generally a rule of thumb. Subsequent to his paper, a lot of other analysis has been done as, is this really the number? And the Trinity study came out, and which was done by, I believe, Trinity University in San Antonio, I believe, and reaffirmed roughly what Mr. Bengen was saying. And then recently, Mr. Bengen came out and said, actually, it's probably closer to 5% now. And that caused a big stir because there's a lot of debate about this. But essentially, what the 4% rule is a systematic or safe withdrawal rate. So if I have $1 million, I should likely be able to draw $40,000 a year, inflation adjusted, over 33 years, and not worry about running out of money, regardless of bad markets or good markets or anything else. So that is essentially what the 4% rule is, which is really just a safe withdrawal rate. So what are some of the advantages of safe withdrawal rate? One is it's simple, right? You just look at the assets you have, you take out 4%, you adjust for inflation. People like simplicity, and I think that's one reason why this has been latched onto by the planning community, and there's so much debate about this quote-unquote rule. It's because it's simple. Another advantage is, based on data, you should likely not run out of money if you take out 4% a year adjusted for inflation. So it solves for the number one issue in retirement, which is securing your outcomes. So what are some of the disadvantages of it? And this is a rule of thumb that gets beat up all the time. One, it's a very simplistic way to approach life because each life is different. And that's where you got to be careful. And Jamie highlighted this in our conversation is there's a lot of academic people really looking at this stuff. And when an academic looks at something, they're looking at aggregate, the whole population, rather than an individual person. What works for everybody, not what specifically works for you. And so academic research is really helpful from a macro perspective, but when it gets down to you, figuring out your plan for your life, the life that you only get one iteration at, one chance at, these rules start to become a lot less meaningful. It's a strict rule. You take out 4% adjusted for inflation of the financial capital. So it doesn't really account for how people actually live. It doesn't account for goals. So this is not a goals-based type of planning structure. We talk a lot about variability in your spending, your go-go years, your slow-go years. Well, 4% rule or safe withdrawal rate isn't going to think about that. It doesn't care whether you want to gift to your children in the first 10 years or rent a house for extra money in the first 10 years so you can create memories. A safe withdrawal rate doesn't care about that. So it doesn't really account for that variability in spending. It has ongoing management. And where a lot of the argument comes with this 4% rule or safe withdrawal rate and what that number actually is, where a lot of the discussion comes about is it doesn't account for changing market conditions, meaning it's only looking at historical returns and historical average inflation or life shocks. It doesn't look at those things. It doesn't look at, well, bonds are near zero. We have a question later on in the Q&A session, or bonds are near zero. Shouldn't we change what our return assumptions? Should we assume that it's going to be what the historical averages are, or should we change them because, quote unquote, it's different this time? That's a big issue people have with this systematic withdrawal rate. And I think one major disadvantage to the systematic withdrawal rate is that in all likelihood, you'll die with more money than you intended to die with in order to be a safe withdrawal rate. Meaning that if you follow it religiously, you may be a high likelihood that you'll be okay, but you may have what we call as regrets. Wait a second, I'm 80 and I got all this money. Man, I should have gone on that trip in my 60s. Those kind of regrets. So it ignores regret minimization and because it doesn't look at variability in spending. It's just saying, here's what we think you can get safely rather than you managing your unique life. So I think that's one disadvantage. Some may call that an advantage. So that is essentially what the safe withdrawal rate is. Now, what is its viability as a strategy for you? Well, and we're going to talk about that in week 4, but there is a segment of people where this is an appropriate strategy. And there's a segment of people where this is the worst strategy they could use. And we're going to talk about how you figure out where you fit in that mix. But that is essentially what we're talking about here when we talk about a 4% rule. It's really a safe withdrawal rate, and people debate about what that is. And this is a tool that we're going to have in the toolbox for you to choose from, but it's not the only tool. So next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about another approach in withdrawing money, which is called the safety first approach, which takes a very different view on how to provide your retirement paycheck, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to listener questions. This is one of my favorite segments of the show where we focus on your questions and try to help you, but also help others that have similar questions to have a framework for how do you deal with this stuff. So if you have a question for the show, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/ask Roger, and you can submit your question. Also, by the way, we'll have links to the Trinity study on the 4% rule, as well as Bengen's in our 6-Shot Saturday email, which is our weekly email where we give you a summary of the show, but that's where we always share links to resources and things that we mention in the show. So if you'd like to be on that weekly email, you can go to rogerwhitney.com. And if you go all the way to the bottom to the footer, you can put in your first name and your email, and you'll get our weekly email. That way you can get the resources that we talk about. So our first question comes from Christian, and this may be one of the most important questions I've got asked in a long time. And it's about mountain bike trails. He has like a 3-part question. Part 1 is, what tire width do you use on trails? Well, my bike is, I think it's a 2.4-inch tire on trails. And he says, how is your gearing? Well, my mountain bike is a Yeti SB115 Blanco, and it has an XTR 1051 drivetrain, which is essentially what he's talking about. Gearing is when you switch gears, what are the ratios in terms of it getting easier? But if you look at the XTR 10 to 51, you'll see the ratios on there. It's geeky stuff. But what is more important for everybody is, do you feel safe on narrow mountain bike trails? Is his next question. Yeah, I do. And I've done some epic trails that we were riding on the edge of cliffs and things like that. And what's interesting about riding like that, like when you see the YouTube videos of people riding on really tight trails on the edge of mountains, is it looks scary and epic. In truth, when you're actually doing the riding, you don't notice a lot of that because you're so focused on what your line is in terms of where your bike's going and the path that you're choosing, that you don't look up a lot to notice the beauty, especially when you're in the tighter situations, Christian. And that's actually one of the appeals of mountain biking to me. And I think other sports do this as well. But what I like about mountain biking is I can't let my mind wander. I'm not thinking, I'm literally in the moment because I'm managing my balance on the bike. I'm moving my body around. I'm focused on finding my next line and my next line. There's not enough margin of attention to let my mind wander to work or to family or to anything. You're in the moment and focused. And that's what I like about it because I can tend to overthink things and I think for a living. It's nice not to think. So you don't really notice, but I do feel safe. Now, have I broken stuff? Have I knocked myself out? Sure. And his last question is it not too steep for a retiree? One, I'm not retired. Don't know if I'll ever be. And I don't ever want to lose that sense of adventure. So this year, when I got back from Colorado, I rode with a client who is retired in their 60s. Last year, she and I rode and we did what's called the Monarch Crest Trail, which is considered an epic trail. It's about 40 miles, most of it above 10,000 feet. She's in her mid 60s and she had to stop and wait up for me all the time. And I have other clients, actually most of them ladies, a lot of men too, that are mountain biking and they're just great. I don't think you ever want to stop this kind of stuff. If you're physically able to, is it not too steep for a retiree? I actually question the premise of that question. It assumes that you have to stop doing things at a certain age. Now, you may have to stop doing certain things. I don't run anymore because I have had 3 knee surgeries and my knee doesn't feel very good if I try to run. That just means I pivot to doing other things, but I don't stop doing something. And the most healthy people I know in retirement, they don't stop doing something because of their age. They stop because of other reasons and they go find something else. I'm not trying to magnify this too much, but those little premises that get caught in some of these questions are really important. I don't care if you're 55, 65, or 70. If you have the ability and the desire to go mountain bike, go. Go. If it's something that feeds your life. I'm excited actually because they have electric assisted mountain bikes now, and they're a little heavy and I don't use one now, but this kind of technology is going to help us extend our ability to do very exciting things, even when our body starts to mess around with us. There's my view on mountain biking. All right. Our next question comes from Michael on investment returns. And this is very related to some of the criticisms of a safe withdrawal rate. It says, Roger, I very much appreciate your podcast. Please keep them coming. Never going to stop. Don't worry, Michael. I have a question on assumed portfolio returns, which is challenging since you are predicting the future, right? If you make an assumption of the return that you're going to get in a bond or a stock, you're predicting what you think is going to happen in the future. And then he says, going forward, investment grade bonds or individual bonds will yield very little, and bond funds may actually have negative returns if interest rates go up for the next few years. So that's his preface. His question, 2-part. First is the 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio outdated? And if yes, what are the alternatives? And then his second question is, what is a suggested portfolio return assumption going forward, knowing that bonds will be limited at best? And there have been periods like 2000 to 2010 when the equity markets were basically break even. Thank you. It's a big question, Michael, and it's an important question. And I want to make sure I treat it as such. And so here are my views on it. I remember 15, 20 years ago, Must have been longer than that because I was a major firm. I wasn't independent yet. I think I was at UBS. And a client and I were working on placing a bet. And the bet was that interest rates were going to go up. Interest rates at that time were historically lower than we've ever seen. And we wanted to short the 30-year treasury. Short means you sell it and then it goes down and you buy it back. And so it's like the opposite of buying low and selling high. You sell high and buy low. The idea is by shorting the 30-year treasury, the bet was interest rates are going to increase, which is going to cause the value of the 30-year treasury to go down, and we would profit if interest rates went up. Because we were at historically low interest rates, and the thesis was, for whatever reason, economic cycle or whatever else, interest rates are going to go up. This was 15, 20 years ago, Michael. We ended up not doing that bet. If I recall, we didn't do it, or we did it for a very short period of time and then unwound it. But the point is, we have been wondering and predicting that interest rates are going to go up for the last 15, 20 years. And in fact, they've done the exact opposite. Now, you could argue that, well, at this point, they got to go up, right? There's no other place to go but up. Sure there is. They can stay the same for a very, very long period of time with low inflation. They could go down. Many countries have negative interest rates. We don't. Now, what are they going to do? Bond yields and bond prices? I have no earthly clue. Is the 60-40 portfolio outdated? Meaning 60% stocks, 40% bonds? I have no earthly clue. What are return assumptions? What return assumptions should we use for bonds or stocks or real estate, or you choose your poison? I have no earthly clue. In all honesty, I spend virtually no time trying to come up with forward-looking returns assumptions on any asset class. And here's my reason. Got a couple of them. Number one is it's predicting the future. And what I choose to do is to use as much historical data as I can on what the average return, what the standard deviation has been, which is the variability on return for each asset class. And I just use that because that average return is going to encompass really bad markets, really good markets, and everything in between. The standard deviation is going to capture how volatile the returns have been historically around the average for each individual asset classes. I just try to use all the historical data and leave it at that. Same thing with inflation. Now, I have gotten into some fairly heated discussions with other of my peers who choose to use forward-looking returns. So for those of you that don't know what a forward-looking return is, you pick some basis for analysis, price to earnings ratio, the Shiller PE, interest rates, economic cycle. You pick some framework to evaluate the current situation, and then you use that framework for valuation to say, well, these things are overvalued right now. So in the next 5 years or the next 10 years, they're going to become undervalued. So we're going to take the average return and decrease the average by X percent to accommodate for the fact that we're in this point of the cycle or we're at this valuation level based on whatever matrix you want to use. So that's what a lot of people do for returns. They predict what's going to be different in the future. I don't do that. And the reason I don't do that is because I think it's a fool's game. Because you can't predict the future. And doesn't matter how sophisticated your economic model is, your valuation model is, you're still guessing at the end of the day. And just like using the average return and the average standard deviation and so forth, that's a guess too, but at least it's all the data. And it allows me to not spend my most precious resource, my time and attention, focusing on something that is unknowable anyway and impossible to predict. I would much rather spend my time on things that I have more control over that will have a bigger impact on the overall plan for a client or things that we talk about in the club than on things that I can't predict. Because in my view, rather than try to predict the future if it's unknowable, and this was like at least a pivotal moment for me as a planner, was I looked around, I'm like, everybody is trying to predict the future and they're spending almost all their time on their return assumptions, inflation assumptions, and spending assumptions. They're spending 99% of their time there, and it's all fundamentally unknowable. So what I chose to do was say, well, if I'm dealing with something that's fundamentally unknowable, rather than focus on all my time on trying to figure out something that I can't, let me spend all my time focused on building frameworks to manage and make little decisions to navigate the uncertainty. So as life unfolds, you can make all these little adjustments based on what's actually happening. So you can make tweaks to your spending, tweaks to your investment portfolio, tweaks to your life decisions based on what life is actually dealing you in terms of cards. So rather than try to predict and do some forward-looking returns, Michael, even on bonds, I use the data that I have, and then through agile retirement management, have lots of little conversations. So we're always tweaking the model as we get more data. And good example here, 15 years later, bonds have been one of the best performing asset classes, or at least a good one. Now, in terms of this 60-40 portfolio, Michael, that's actually a great discussion for this overall topic of this month on withdrawal rates. What you'll find at the end is I am a proponent more of a hybrid strategy of matching your assets to your liabilities. So in the near term, securing outcomes for the spending that you have in retirement. And then as the time frames stretch out, being almost 100% equities and non-bond like. So a 60-40 portfolio isn't just some homogeneous thing. What I believe is you plan out your cash flows, and then that determines what your allocation is rather than trying to pick an allocation. And we'll get into that a little bit in a few weeks. So hopefully that answers your question. Our next question is one of my favorite questions, which is a audio question from Tyler on Roth conversions and being 55 years old.
Hi, Roger. This is Tyler. I was really excited to hear the topic for the month of July because I think I have a question that fits right in. I am a far piece from retirement, but do intend to retire early at 55 from my current company. And I know that I can start taking distributions without penalty, but I was wondering if I could do Roth conversions when I'm still 55. Or if not, would you still suggest I take distributions from my 401k to kind of balance out the pre-tax versus post-tax accounts?
Hey, Tyler, I'm glad you're excited for this series. Hopefully I do it justice for you. You put a couple things in there. So you're going to retire after age 55, and you're wondering if you can do Roth conversions. Well, you can do a Roth conversion whenever you want if you have IRA assets, and now some 401ks are allowing it. So that's good. And then your question is, now, if you're referring to the rule of 55, where you're allowed to take withdrawals from a defined contribution plan if you retire after your age 55, my understanding is you can't take the withdrawal and do a conversion, but what you could do is do a direct rollover to an IRA and then do a conversion from there. So you'll have to check with your 401k plan. But the broader question is, even if you don't need the money, should you be taking money from your IRA either to put it into an after-tax bucket or into a conversion to a Roth bucket, even if you don't need the money? So that's going to go into the big rock number 3, the optionality, the tactical rock. And the answer is, I don't know. The way I would figure that out is I would map out how you're paying for life. And as you get close to retirement, do a 5 to 8 year cash flow timeline. So show all your income year by year that you expect to have, and show your spending year by year, and then show your tax liability in each year. And that's going to give you a deficit each year or surplus, depending on if your income's higher than your spending. But it'll also tell you, one, how much you need to get from your cash, right, to cover the deficit if you don't have enough income to pay for life. And it also will tell you roughly what tax bracket you forecast yourself being in. And when you have those pieces of information, you're going to be in a much better position to determine, do I take money from my IRA or 401k to pay for life? Or do I take some to do a Roth conversion because I'm in 12% tax bracket or the 22% tax bracket? You're going to be in a much better position to see those pieces on the board. So if you do that, create this 5 to 6 year, 7 year cash flow timeline, so you know how much you need from your financial assets and you have an idea of what tax bracket you might fall into each year, then you can start to explore, do I do Roth conversions or take money out so I can take advantage of tax brackets? So hopefully that gives you some framework. And I think we've talked about that in the past. Our last question comes from Richard on home equity. Richard says, how do I think about home equity? I am 5 to 10 years from retirement, about to pay off my mortgage. I got about a $700,000 house, and a big piece of my net worth is in my home equity, but we have no plans to move. Does my equity help me at all? Really good question, Richard, because you're in a situation that a lot of people find themselves in having a good part of their net worth tied up in the equity of their home, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it begs the question, does this home equity help you at all? I think of a home as what I call a use asset, meaning that your primary return on your home, just like a car, is your enjoyment of the thing. So in the sense of your home, it could be your backyard. The fact that you have a roof over your head is your primary return on that use asset. It's not a productive asset in the same way that, say, a stock or a bond or other kinds of income real estate might be. So does your home equity help you at all? Well, there are a couple ways that it could potentially help you over the long term. Home prices generally have an upward slant in terms of increasing every year. Now, we've seen crazy growth on homes right now. Sometimes they'll go down in value, but generally they're going to go up 3% a year or so. So you're going to be building a value in this use asset over a very long period of time, assuming you never move from your house. So how might you tap that home equity and turn it into productive financial assets is really the question. How does this help me? And there are a couple of ways that you can do that. There is one, right now you don't have any plans of moving, but as your home increases in value, you could unleash part of the value of that use asset by selling your home and downsizing and pocketing the difference, because you're assuming that you buy a home that's worth less than the house that you have now because it's smaller. Or you could sell the home sometime in the future to go into continuous living retirement community and use the equity of your home to buy your way into that. And that could be something you do 15, 20 years down the road. You could use a home equity line of credit, a HELOC, to borrow against the equity in your home in order to pay for an unexpected expense, to build onto the home, etc. Usually, you see a home equity line of credit used to improve the house, but you could also use it for other purposes. So you could tap a good portion of that home equity in the event that you needed it. And a third way, and this is a way that we're going to evaluate in more in depth on a future episode, is you could potentially do a reverse mortgage, which is essentially earn a paycheck using your home equity for as long as you and your spouse are alive, and actually create a pension income off of it while still enjoying the use of the house. And then the trade-off is when you pass away, the sale of the house pays off the amount of money that they were sending you. So your home equity does have some utility in your retirement planning, and it's probably the one area that we don't think about or plan for enough. So it's a great question, and we're going to dive into this home equity question, like I said, probably in a month-long theme, because it could be a big component of the whole retirement strategy. So hopefully that helps you, Richard. With that, let's get to this week's SMART Sprint.
On your marks, get set.
So we're off to set a SMART sprint to take a little baby step towards rocking retirement. And what I'd like you to do over the next 7 days is go to YouTube and Google domino chain reaction and watch this video from a physics professor that shows the power of micro goals or micro efforts. Because essentially what you see is that a domino can knock down a subsequent domino that's 1.5 times bigger than its own size. And what he shows is like, let's assume you had 13 dominoes and you started with a very, very tiny domino that's 5 millimeters tall. Look at how small that is. And you set up 13 dominoes, each subsequent domino being 1.5 times bigger than the prior one. Well, the last domino in this 13 domino series would be about 3 feet tall. And you could literally push the 5 millimeter domino and over 13 iterations, push over something significantly larger than the first action. And it's a really cool video, and it's a great demonstration of the power of iteration and agile retirement management. And the whole point of these SMART sprints, of taking these little baby steps, these micro actions in an intentional way, and how the power of those can compound in magnitude more than you can ever imagine. And that, my friend, is how you actually rock retirement. So go check that out. It's called Domino Chain Reaction. Well, I'm so glad to be back in the saddle in Fort Worth, Texas, even though we enjoyed our time in Colorado. And I feel energized, and that's part of taking a sabbatical like I did. And I'm excited about this series. So next week, we're going to talk about the safety first approach and what that means as a tool for you to choose a strategy. So if you want links to the things that we talk about, go to rogerwhitney.com, go to the bottom, and on the footer, you can put your name and email, and we'll send you 6 Shots Saturday with links to the things that we're talking about. Beyond that, I hope you have a wonderful day. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize it's helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.